For years, we've heard the warnings about the tragedy of the commons, the idea that when people act from pure self-interest, shared resources inevitably collapse. It's a pessimistic story about human nature. But what if there's another way to view the commons? A way that opens up an entirely different spiritual possibility. Welcome to We Have a Spiritual Problem, a podcast where we confront the deeper questions beneath our personal struggles and collective crises. I am your host, Dr. Jeff Armstrong. I am not a theologian or a philosopher, or at least by training. I am a PhD exercise physiologist with an interest in the intersection of the physical and the spiritual. Today, we explore a reframing of Garrett Hardin's classic essay, The Tragedy of the Commons. Instead, we consider the alternative, the glory of the commons. We consider the deeper spiritual meaning behind how we relate to one another, to nature, and to the larger story we are a part of. And as we'll see, this idea connects directly with our themes of selfish versus selfless, the divided self, and the search for the third way, self-transcendence. When I look back on the formative ideas that have shaped my worldview, especially during my undergraduate years, it's striking how many certain concepts burrow deeply into the mind and stay there, untouched, unquestioned, almost sacred. One of those concepts for me was Garrett Hardin's 1968 essay, The Tragedy of the Commons. If you've ever taken an intro course in ecology, economics, political science, philosophy, environmental science, almost anything really, then you may have encountered it. If you're not familiar, Hardin relates a story about a shared pasture, a commons, where each herdsman can graze their cattle. Each herdsman acts rationally and individually, adding more animals to increase profit. But because everyone does this, the pasture is ultimately destroyed. The resource collapses. It's a parable of collective ruin driven by individual self-interest. I first read Hardin's essay in the early 1980s in a general education geography course at West Virginia University. The idea lodged itself deep in my mind, so deep in fact that I still have a typewritten copy of the paper I wrote over 40 years ago. Hardin's essay became more than just a pasture or an argument for answers to a growing population. It became an allegory for the entire human project. I internalized Hardin's message so thoroughly that I ended up assigning the same essay to my students in my pathophysiology and exercise class decades later. I asked my students to consider it in light of healthcare, particularly the idea of universal healthcare as a fundamental human right. But recently, surprisingly, a conversation expanded that 40-year-old mindset. I recently interviewed Tim Christophersen, a global leader in ecosystem restoration and author of the book Generation Restoration for the Aging Well podcast. At one point in our conversation, Tim commented that there was an alternative to the tragedy of the commons. He called it the glory of the commons. He didn't emphasize it. He didn't dramatically set it up. It wasn't a thesis he was trying to argue. But it was a phrase he used naturally, as if everyone had already understood the commons in this way. The glory of the commons. I'd never heard anyone speak about the commons in that kind of language. The commons was always tragic. The commons was a cautionary tale. The commons was a warning about the dangers of human nature. But glory? That is something else entirely. It struck me as theological. It aligned with our spies model that I often speak of. He had stepped into Teilhard de Chardin's territory, the territory of convergence and meaning and its spiritual evolution. The phrase echoed in my mind. Even while Tim kept talking, I felt myself drifting into that phrase, exploring it, turning it over, trying to understand why it landed so deeply. And the answer is that the phrase didn't just challenge the ecological or economic assumptions of Hardin's essay. It challenged the spiritual assumptions underneath it. Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons model is ultimately a story about human nature. Humans are inherently self-interested. Humans inevitably overexploit. Humans cannot be trusted with shared resources. Therefore, we need some form of external control, regulation, privatization, coercion, to prevent us from destroying each other and our world. Hardin's worldview, whether intentionally or not, seems to suggest that humans are spiritually limited, that we are incapable of self-transcendence, that we are doomed to prioritize the self at the expense of the whole. It is, at its core, a deeply pessimistic view of who we are and who we can be. I had just recorded episode 49 of this podcast, I Am Third, Rethinking Self in a Self-Centered Age. Tim's phrase cracked open an entirely different possibility. The glory of the commons suggests that humans are capable of unity, capable of cooperation, capable of stewardship, capable of orienting themselves toward a shared good. It suggests that we are not driven by self-interest, but by belonging, reciprocity, and a yearning for connection. Spiritually speaking, it suggests that the commons may be one of the places where humanity awakens to itself, where we discover our capacity for self-transcendence. The glory of the commons opened a new way to consider spiritual evolution in Teilhard's Omega Point. I found myself connecting it to ideas we've been exploring on this podcast, ideas about the divided self, about selfishness versus selflessness, about the integration of the physical and the spiritual. Because the tragedy of the common story is, in a sense, the story of the divided self externalized. It's the story of individuals unable to restrain their impulses, unable to choose the long-term good over short-term gratification, unable to see themselves as part of the greater whole. It's the same tension we've explored within each of us, the part of us that wants comfort, security, control, gratification, survival, and the part of us that longs for meaning, purpose, union, transcendence, and participation in something larger. Within each of us, there is a commons, a shared inner space where our impulses, desires, fears, hopes, and deeper aspirations interact. The divided self is the internal tragedy of the commons, the survival-driven ego overgrazing the landscape of our lives, taking more than it needs, exhausting inner resources meant to sustain the spiritual development. The tragedy of the commons mindset assumes we cannot or will not choose the higher path, that the lower impulses will always win. But the glory of the commons mindset suggests something radically different, that the self is capable of integration, that the survival-oriented self and the meaning-oriented self can coexist, collaborate, and harmonize, that the inner commons can become a place not of conflict, but of coherence. So what shifts us from tragedy to glory? What moves the self from fragmentation to wholeness? What guides humanity from exploitation to stewardship? The answer, I believe, is spirituality, not in the narrow sense of religion or piety, but in the broader sense of orientation. Spirituality is, at its core, the practice of orienting the self towards something larger than the self. It is the gradual reorientation from ego to essence, from separation to unity, from fear to love, from possession to participation. The commons is fundamentally spiritual because it asks us to perceive the world and our place in it in terms of relationship rather than ownership. It invites us to see ourselves not as isolated individuals, but as members of a vast and interconnected whole. And this is where Teilhard de Chardin comes in. Regular listeners and viewers will recall that Teilhard, the Jesuit priest and paleontologist, believed that consciousness is evolving toward what he called the Omega Point, a state of unified awareness characterized by love, cooperation, connection, and spiritual integration. He believed that evolution is not just biological, but also psychological, social, and spiritual. And crucially, he believed that the direction of evolution is toward increasing unity. If Teilhard were alive today, I believe he would recognize the commons as a spiritual laboratory, a place where humanity is learning how to evolve beyond its fragmented state. The commons forces us to confront our interdependence. It requires us to develop the capacity for collective care. It invites us into what Teilhard would call the sphere of love, where we recognize ourselves as participants in a larger whole. But moving from tragedy to glory is not easy. It requires sacrifice. And here's where we must be honest. Sacrifice is a deeply spiritual discipline. Every meaningful choice costs something. I express this as opportunity costs. To say yes to stewardship is to say no to exploitation. To say yes to the long-term flourishing of the commons is to say no to short-term personal gain. To say yes to unity is to say no to the comfort of isolation or the illusion of self-sufficiency. Every stage of human spiritual development involves a surrender of ego. And the commons is where that surrender becomes practical. It is where spiritual growth meets physical reality. It's where the integration of the physical and the spiritual becomes visible. But here's the key insight. Sacrifice in this context is not loss, but investment. When we sacrifice for the commons, we are not diminishing ourselves. We are enlarging ourselves. We are expanding our identity to include the whole. We are shifting from the small self to the larger self. In spiritual terms, we are participating in self-transcendence. Self-transcendence is the third way beyond selfish and selfless. Selfishness says, I win, you lose. Selflessness, in the unhealthy form, says, you win, I lose. But self-transcendence says, we rise together. It says that the flourishing of the individual and the flourishing of the whole are not in conflict, but in alignment. It sees the self not as an isolated entity, but as a node in a larger web of being. This is why the glory of the commons is not just a social or ecological idea. It is a spiritual invitation. It invites us to ask, what kinds of beings are we becoming? What kind of future are we shaping? What does it mean to live in relationship with the whole? And what are we willing to give up and to take on in service of something greater than ourselves? The spiritual crises of our time are fundamentally the crises of the commons. Climate change, political polarization, social fragmentation, economic inequality. These are all failures of stewardship. I could paraphrase the comments of my friend and frequent guest on this podcast, Lauren Axelrod, who inspired this podcast and the title, We Have a Spiritual Problem, and say, we don't have a problem with climate change, with corporate greed, with poverty. You can insert the problem. We have a problem of the commons. These are external symptoms of an internal spiritual problem. If Tim Christophersen is right, and I believe he is, the glory of the commons is emerging. Not everywhere, not all at once, but in pockets of restoration, collaboration, and awakening all over the world. What does the path forward look like? It looks like small acts of stewardship, choosing to use less, choosing to give more, choosing to repair instead of discard, choosing to listen instead of dominating, choosing to align our daily lives with the long-term health of the whole. It looks like community sharing resources, restoring ecosystems, supporting one another, building trust. It looks like individuals waking up to their interconnectedness and choosing to participate in the story of glory rather than the story of tragedy. The glory of the commons is not a utopian fantasy. It is a spiritual possibility rooted in the reality of who we are and who we can become. It challenges us to see ourselves not as isolated individuals, but as participants in a shared world, a shared future, and a shared spiritual journey. And so I want to close with a question I asked earlier, and now with deeper resonance. In what story are you choosing to participate? The story of tragedy, the narrative of fear, scarcity, separation, and self-protection? Or the story of glory, the narrative of connection, stewardship, unity, and self-transcendence? The commons is waiting for your answer. The commons is waiting for my answer. And the spiritual future of humanity may depend on how we choose. Thank you for exploring this with me. The commons may once have been a parable of doom, but today it's becoming a doorway to glory. And the choice to walk through that doorway is, ultimately, a spiritual one. If this resonated with you, please like and follow so we can grow our audience, and share this podcast with a friend. Until next time, be good to yourself, your transcendent self, and be good to others. The commons depends on it.